We were going to do this Zoom a week ago, but it all seemed a little bit too confusing then, and we thought we might just be adding to the noise. But there has now been plenty of time to think and analyse what's happened and the role that religious groups have played in electing Joe Biden to the White House, or indeed in trying to keep him out. And maybe we can also start thinking about what a new administration might mean for the kind of issues that resonate with religious voters. So our expert commentators today, thank you very much for joining us. They are Bob Smietana, national reporter with the Religion News Service, Robbie Jones, CEO, founder of the Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, and Tom Gjelten, who's the Religion and Belief correspondent for National Public Radio News. You'll all have questions, and I'd like you to feel that you can raise the blue hand or write in the chat box at any time to ask one, and I'll bring you in. But I've got a million of questions if you haven't got any, so I'm just going to start. And I'm going to start by asking each of you very briefly, if you could in turn, for your top line about the significance or otherwise of the religious vote in this election. Tom, can I start with you?
Sure, thanks, Rosie, and greetings to my friends Robbie and Bob, whom I've worked with and known for some time. And actually, I'll quote Robbie since you went to me first. I talked to Robbie last week about this, and he pointed out that the faith electorate is pretty stable over the years. Faith groups vote pretty much the same way every year, and I would totally endorse that. However, one little caveat, which is remember that the 2016 election was a relatively close election, certainly in the battleground states that sort of determined the outcome. And 2020 was once again a pretty close election in those states. What that means is that a relatively small shift in the voting patterns of people can be very decisive. And I think we saw that in this election. It didn't really take very much to swing this election to Joe Biden. We saw a small increase in the number of votes among white Catholics that Biden got, and a very small apparent, and Robbie and Bob may have different views on this, apparently a very small decrease in the number of white evangelicals who supported Trump in some of these battleground states. It's hard to know how much to make of these small shifts, but as they say, in a close election, even small shifts can be very important.
So Bob, what do you make of those small shifts? Or have you got is your top line different?
No, my top line is very similar. My top line is that America's religious groups are divided mostly by race. It's white Christians on one side, especially white evangelicals, and white Catholics and white mainliners, and everyone else on the other side, or majorities. Not it's majorities other cases on the other side. So. Yeah, Tom is right. There's just a little small shift. Ryan Burge, who's another sociologist, has some interesting data on nuns, that nuns who might have gone for Trump in the past. So these are unaffiliated, maybe went for him a little bit less. In places like Georgia. And then I think the other part we forget about is Black Protestants really showed up in this. We had large turnout, and they are the most religious people in America, and they are the most one-sided, I think, in their voting. Very, very devoted to the Democratic Party, and in places like Georgia, where Black Protestants make a large part of the population, and that really, and in parts of Michigan, it really paid off.
Robbie, what's your top line?
Great. Well, yeah, thanks. I'm really happy to be here with Tom and Bob and to talk about this. So I think, yeah, I was planning on starting exactly where Bob did, at kind of 100,000 feet, a flyover, and just to say, like, we're looking at the landscape from that level. That has been the truth really since Reagan, that the religious landscape has been very, very stable, and it has looked exactly like that. White Christian groups, and the big three that we usually talk about are white evangelicals, white mainline Protestants. That's the two Protestant groups, and then white Catholics in that group. And historically, white evangelicals have been somewhere between 75 and 80% supporting Republican candidates, and white Catholics and white mainline Protestants have been somewhere around 6 and 10 supporting Republican candidates. And that remained largely true in this election cycle as well. And then it's also important to note, as Bob did, that like non-white Protestants and non-white Catholics tend to vote in actually strong majorities the other way for Democratic candidates. So, this divide that we see, I think, is really worth noting. I think we take it for granted, but it's kind of astonishing, really. If you take a step back from it and look at it with kind of new eyes, the distance between white evangelical Protestants and African American Protestants, for example, right? 8 and 10 white evangelicals supporting Republican candidates, 9 and 10 African American Protestants supporting Democratic candidates, and the divide among Latinos, the divide among Catholics is nearly as big between white and Latino Catholics. You have white Catholics supporting Republican candidates about 6 and 10. They're a little bit less than that, a few points here, and Latino Catholics 2/3 supporting Democratic candidates. So again, this racial and ethnic divide running through really and stratifying religion. And then the last thing I'll say is about the unaffiliated in this group. So that group has been growing in the US, as you all know. It's about a quarter of the population now. This is the first election where the estimates from the exit polls show them at roughly coming anywhere near their proportion of the general population. They're roughly 24% of the population. The exit polls have them at around 22% of the voting population. That's the first time we've seen that. If we go back to 2012, for example, they were only 12% of the voting population, despite being about 20% of the population. So they kind of closed the gap between where they are in the population and their turnout. So basically, their turnout rates are starting to catch up with white evangelicals and other members of the electorate. And one final big asterisk I'm going to put on everything I just said is that the exit polls are really rough estimates. And so I would caution, if anything less than a 5-point shift, we ought to put a big grain of salt on them. They're really meant to be rough estimates, and particularly, exit polls, even though they're very large, they are a poll. They have a margin of error. And so especially when you're comparing 2016 to 2020, both of those exit polls have margins of error, right? So you need to kind of take that into account. And I'd caution against over interpreting anything like a 3 or 4 point shift, because there just may be some noise in there. And the one last caveat in reading the tea leaves and the exit polls is that we did have some third-party candidates in 2016 that mostly took votes from Hillary Clinton's side of the ledger. So if we're comparing 2016, 2020, I think the best apples to apples comparison is really on the Trump side of the ledger to see where he gained or lost folks, because there was this little third party complication, and particularly among the unaffiliated, for example, there were about eight points of the unaffiliated in 2016 that voted for third party candidates, and that looks like most of them came home because they do tend to lean more progressive and supported Biden in this election.
But if the faith vote is basically very stable, I mean, in 2008, McCain got 78% of the white evangelical vote, which is what it seems that Trump got this time. What difference does it make? What difference does it make that the Democrats, for instance, this time reached out to faith groups in a way that they didn't in 2016 or 2012? I mean, Tom, was it worth their shoe leather? I'm
not convinced. There was some effort to reach white evangelicals on the part of Democrats, or rather opponents of President Trump. I'm not sure that it was actually very consequential in the end. I think I'm inclined to think that the effort to reach Catholic voters was a little bit more consequential, and that, I don't know whether that was as much a deliberate effort as it was the fact that Joe Biden is himself a Catholic and really talked about that a lot and came from that part of the country where Catholic voters are very important. Catholics outnumber evangelicals in the 3 big states that constituted the blue wave, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So I think it made a great deal of sense for the Biden campaign to really target Catholic voters in those areas. Ryan Burge, whom Bob Smietana quoted earlier, is counseling Democrats and Republicans alike just to forget about white evangelicals because they are so predictable that it doesn't really make any difference. He says that Democrats should just give up on them entirely and Republicans should take them for granted. I think that over the years, we have seen that Catholics tend to be much more sort of a swing voter group.
It wasn't ever going to probably change the vote, but what about the failure of the Democrats with Hispanic Catholics in Florida, Bob? I mean, did they just not pay them any attention, or was that a surprise at all?
That's a good question, and I don't have a good answer. I know, Florida's different. Florida's a strange state. There's a lot of places that he did really well with Cuban Americans who are different than other. So I think one thing we were reminded of is that the Hispanic vote in the U.S. is not a block. It's very different in very different places. So Arizona, we may have a very different turnout than we had in Florida. And then you have the Hispanic Pentecostals and evangelicals in Florida who are probably growing. And that's where I think some of us kind of laughed when Trump started his evangelicals for Trump campaign in Florida at a Pentecostal megachurch. Well, maybe he was onto something, because Hispanic Protestants in particular seem to be more open to voting for Trump in a way that Hispanic Catholics aren't.
Was that a surprise for you, Robbie, about Hispanic Catholics in Florida, or was that entirely predictable, given the sort of that they sort of vote on issues of immigration and race in much the way that other people do in Florida?
Well, yeah, I'll echo, Bob, and saying Florida is, you talk to any pollster, Florida is the nightmare state to try to get right. It's such a bizarre state. It's got this heavy, Jewish constituency. It's got kind of older Jewish people moved down there and for retirement. It's got this Cuban population in the south, and then the upper panhandle is basically Georgia, right? So it's a very complicated state. And it's a complicated state for Latinos in particular, for the reasons that Bob mentioned. So I think, a little bit of surprise there, but here's the other thing, but we also saw similar things down in the very southern tip of Texas as well, some surprising counties down there. But I think it is a good reminder that actually the Latino population, as it's been growing, right, it's just 12% or so of the population, is not as monolithic as one might think. The country of origin makes a lot of difference. Education levels make a lot of difference, and the Catholic Protestant split, as Bob mentioned, is massively consequential. Hispanic Protestants are not nearly as on board with Trump as white evangelicals are, but they're basically divided around Trump. His favorability among them, for example, was about 50-50 throughout the year, whereas white evangelicals were like 3/4 favorable throughout the year. But the other thing I think to say here is that Latinos don't actually rank immigration as their most critical issue. And I think that's really important to remember. The things they rank up top are healthcare and education and jobs, and immigration after that, right? So it's a more complex thing. So like in the southern tip of Texas, job loss, and particularly oil jobs down there, and the scarcity of those in the bleak future, many of some of those jobs, may have played as big a role, as anything else going on. So I think it's a more complex way of kind of thinking about voting, I think, than many people want to just attach one issue to that group, but it's certainly more than that.
You mentioned there older Jewish people moving to Florida and their vote. I note that the turnout among Jews was also much higher for Trump than has been in previous elections. And I wonder, although obviously not decisive, but I just wonder why you think that is. Anybody?
Well, let me jump in there. I would put 5 asterisks after the Jewish vote number, and not just one. So again, these polls have a sample size, and even if they're very large, Jews make up about 2% of the U.S. population, right? So we're talking about a very, very small sample, and this would go for the Muslim vote as well. There are people like making a lot out of the Muslim breakout in the exit polls. These groups are so small that you would need to see something like 10, 15 point swings to really start like making something of it. So I would just say, like, we'll need some more data, I think, before I'd want to make too much out of any of those shifts.
Tom or Bob?
No, I totally agree with that. If you look at, there are exit poll data on these faith groups, and if you look at Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists, they line up clearly to the left to center. But but you know, I mean, Robbie's a pollster. Robbie knows data, and he's absolutely right. You know, if you want to make generalizations about these groups, you can, but you know, you're on pretty flimsy ground.
Bob, anything about about the Muslim vote? Is there anything I mean, with the caveats that we've just mentioned, is there anything to say about that?
I know there was a lot of enthusiasm, and Michigan is a state where there are a lot of Muslim voters, and there was a lot of attention placed there. I think this is what, if you don't live in the States, and actually if you live in a certain region of the States, you don't realize how different every state is. So I used to live in Chicago, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I live in Tennessee. There are 3 different religious universes. And, you know, if you were here in Tennessee, you'd think everyone was pro-Trump. It was 60-40. It's, you know, Trump flags and Confederate flags all over the place. But if you're in Michigan, it's a Rust Belt state. So there's more white Catholics, more white Protestants, a lot of Black Protestants, a lot of Muslims. And they have become, I think, a pretty energetic voting bloc for Democrats. And so, you know, the United States election, as we were mentioning before, it comes down to a handful of few states, just a few states that really matter, where, you know, a lot of, you know, in California, Democrats are going to win. In New York, they're going to win big. But in states like that, there are enough split where just enough people show up and you get enough turnout and you're going to have differences. So it's a few 100,000 people made Trump, you know, president in 2016, and a few 100,000 are going to make Biden president in those states. Everyone else, you know, is completely divided, but those states are going to be battlegrounds, and so turnout and that's where a small group can really make a big difference.
But I suppose the sort of thing that strikes me about the nones is that, you know, maybe not the next election or the one after that, but the future will be with the future power is going to be with the non-vote, isn't it? And if you're a Republican, that would make you rather worried, wouldn't it?
I think, you know, we've been talking a lot about the racial gap in the U.S. electorate. Just as pronounced is the God gap. You know, the extent to which sort of devout faith voters sort of gravitate to obviously, particularly among whites, gravitate toward the Republicans, and the unaffiliated toward the Democrats. That gap is growing larger and larger. In fact, you know, sort of atheists and agnostics, for example, are like the corollary of white evangelicals. I mean, they vote in very large numbers for Democrats. And so this gap is wide. And if you look at the trends, I mean, the percentage of the US population that does not identify with any religious denomination is growing. And as Robbie said earlier, their share of the voting population, their turnout is growing as well. So this God gap is, if anything, going to increase. And you know, whether it's a concern for Republicans, you know, it would seem to be. Although I think that, you know, I think that Democrats can't sort of ignore faith voters at their peril. We've certainly seen, you know, I've spent a lot of time with Hispanic voters and immigrant groups, and Hispanics, you know, are sort of more religious than other voting groups, and they, you know, feel very strongly about family values and social values. And so, you know, it certainly would be a mistake for Democrats to kind of assume that they can bank their future on the unaffiliated vote. But that gap is definitely growing.
I've got a question from Ruth. Ruth, do you want to ask? Do pile in with questions now, everybody. And Ruth is going to be the first.
It was just to say I saw a tweet from Michelle Obama where she said Biden may have won, but everyone should be very distressed that 50% of the population voted essentially for lies and well, Trump basically. And I'm just wondering how you explain that when the campaigns went after the vote, because we talked about this on an earlier Zoom, and the messages that were going out from the campaigns, and it was something about poverty. It was something about well, a caring society, and that all seems to have been ignored. So the messages fell on deaf ears for 50% of the population. I wonder what your reflection is on that and what could shift it.
Well, I'll jump in on that. So, I think maybe the unstated premise of that question may sound like everyone is up for grabs and the person with the best messaging is going to pull the most people to their side. But that's in fact like not at all, the way that the US population is structured. In fact, when we look at who is not locked in already, just because of partisanship, we're in single digits. That both parties are really fighting over in these presidential elections. I mean, if you just take a look at, for example, let's just take white evangelical support for Republican candidates, right, which has been in this very narrow band, 75 to 80%, election cycle after election cycle. Now, what would explain their support for candidates as diverse and different as Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, John McCain, and George W. Bush, right? I mean, these candidates are not at all cut out of the same cloth. You might even say some of them are like diametrically opposed to one another, and yet they all kind of attract this narrow band of Republican support, white evangelical support, white Catholic support, and white mainline support. And I think the main answer is it tells you something about the power of partisanship in the country, and in particular, the power of negative partisanship. That's really what we see in the political science literature. It's less that we all love the party we vote for, and more that we hate the other party. I mean, when we've asked questions, for example, about what partisans think about the other party, I'll give you two quick examples. When we've asked about whether, say, Democrats think Republicans are, basically on the right track or have the wrong ideas, but are just kind of misguided, or we give them a third option, they're a fundamental danger to the country. We have like 2/3 of Democrats, right at 70%, saying they are a fundamental danger to the party. And we flip it around, we ask Republicans the same thing. We get a mirror opposite, about the same number saying Democrats are a fundamental danger to the country. Sorry, not to the party, but fundamental danger to the country. This year, we asked a different question, and we basically asked whether Democrats were trying to make capitalism work for everyone or whether they had been taken over by socialists. 8 and 10 on this question. 8 and 10 Republicans say that the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists. On the other side, we asked about whether the Republican Party was trying to protect American values and traditions, or whether the Republican Party had been taken over by racists. 8 and 10 Democrats say the Republican Party has been taken over by racists.
I guess it begs the question about whether religious and church leaders actually really have any influence in this at all, or whether actually they're being that they're the base for Democrats and Republicans, sort of pulls them along behind rather than is led by them, I guess. And I'm interested in what Donald Trump's evangelical advisors might be saying to him now. Do you have any ideas about that? I mean, apart from Paula White claiming the victory and Kenneth Copeland sort of braying with laughter, but I mean, with the slightly more sensible ones, what are they saying to him now?
A very important one is Robert Jeffress, of the First Baptist Church in Dallas. Very big church, very powerful figure in the evangelical circles. I would argue more influential than Paula White or Ken Copeland. Yeah. And he is saying that he has already announced that in his judgment, Joe Biden will be the next president, and he has said that he will be praying for him. So I think
that's what God wants, isn't it? That's God chose Trump in 2016, and God has chosen now, because according to Robert Jeffress, who's ever in power is there because God said so.
But that's right. That's right. But I think that was a very important development.
Jeffress has backed off it though. It's interesting. Jeffress is playing an interesting game because he has this thing he wrote for Fox News. God chooses the president. Joe Biden's going to be the president. And then, he got pushback. The Dallas Morning wrote a news story about it. He's pushing back to Twitter. I'm not breaking with the president. He's still my president until December. So there's a kind of fear of letting go of him. And I think we underestimate how influential the Pentecostal, Paula White, Bethel Church, kind of groups are for him. I mean, even Copeland, we can laugh at Copeland, but there are a lot of folks who are in the prosperity gospel Pentecostal world who think that that group made a lot of hay because some of them predicted that Trump, they say God revealed to them these prophecies that Trump was going to be president. And so, and their prophecies now are, he's going to be president, but the devil is trying to keep us from having our president. And they're not backing away from him. I think some of the folks like, Robert Jeffress, who's going to be around long after Trump is he's going to play it both ways. He's not going to say, and Franklin Graham's going to be the same way. They're going to say, we got to count all the votes. And then they will probably say, well, yes, Biden's our president. We're not real happy about it. But I don't think it's interesting. So we ran a story. We at RNS, we're trying to get an interview with Trump. We couldn't get an interview. We asked him some questions. We got some questions back where he said, and we got these through Paula White. So this is probably his team writing them, that he's a non-denominational Christian. And, I think that's a kind of a good way of putting this. Trump has become a kind of mega church, non-denominational pastor. He's the one in charge. He's a tent revivalist. He'll go out into this crowd, and the institutional life of the Republican Party doesn't matter. So he knows he can feel the pulse of his followers, and he can get them all riled up. And these leaders, you don't become like some Robert Jeffress without knowing what people want to hear and how to connect with them, what your audience wants to hear. So they're not going to diss him, and they're not going to say, well, you're wrong. They're going to try and play that game along. They think, and they don't think, they're not going to be sad that they voted for him at all.
Can I jump in here on this point? I think this is a really important point Bob's making. And I think that there is one kind of corollary we can see between the way that Republicans have sort of just basically said the Republican Party is for whatever Donald Trump says it's for, right? This is the first time the Republican Party itself had no party platform, right, at the convention, and just kind of forewent that entire process and basically just said, yeah, whatever this guy says, that's what the party is for. And I think it was because as soon as they put up some principles, Trump was going to violate one of them, right? And they knew it was kind of a kind of losing exercise. I think there is a parallel in the religious world that Bob's pointing to here among evangelical leaders that have kind of cozied up to Trump. That, we, for example, had this polling question that I've come back to time and time again. We asked in 2011, do you think an elected official who commits an immoral act in their private life can nonetheless fulfill their duties and perform their public life? In 2011, we first asked this question. Only 30% of white evangelicals agree with that statement. Now, that's what you'd expect from a group that might call itself, that called itself values voters, and said, look, we have a set of principles. We're going to measure all the candidates against these principles and let the chips fall where they may. We asked this question again in 2016 with Trump at the top of the ticket. That number of those agreeing that this was possible, again, kind of committing an immoral act in your private life and have it not impact your public life, that number of agreeing with that went to 72% among white evangelicals. So I think this idea of putting forward principles and measuring Donald Trump by those principles has been thrown out by both evangelical leaders and Republican leaders. And it's just really as more of a fealty to this person. And, we had a healthy debate among evangelical, at least on the elites. We didn't have a healthy debate among those in the pews, but we did have a healthy debate in 2016 between Russell Moore and Robert Jeffress, for example. I mean, this was like an ongoing, actually substantive public debate with Russell Moore saying, look, if this is what evangelical means, I don't want any part of it. Ultimately, he had to apologize for those comments after the 2016 election. And we didn't see anything like that public dust up among prominent evangelical figures this election.
Well, has Russell Moore said anything post this election? He's the head of the Southern Baptist Convention. Has he made any official statements after this election?
Not much. He's not saying that. He's kind of he's in trouble in his own denomination. There's kind of a move among the Southern Baptists to oust him. What is interesting, actually, really, it's a little bit tangential, but there's kind of a second revolution in the Southern Baptist Convention against anyone who is sort of anti-Trumpist. If you're for social justice, if you're against racism, there is a pushback to say you're a communist and socialist. And there's an active move to get rid of Moore. He's survived for now. I don't know if he will long term. There was no Southern Baptist Convention this year because of COVID. It'll be in Nashville next year. It may be a knockdown, drag-out fight where he is ousted.
One big indication of that is that Albert Mohler, who's the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, and probably the I think it's fair to say one of the really top intellectual leaders in the Southern Baptist world. 2016, he famously announced that he did not vote for Trump. I think he said he did not vote for Hillary Clinton either, but he did not vote for Trump, and was very outspoken in his criticism of Trump. This year, he was equally outspoken in saying he had changed his mind, and this year he did vote for Trump. And I think he's positioned to be the incoming president of the Southern Baptists. So that, he's a smart guy, and I think he's detecting the shifting winds in the Southern Baptist world.
Mm-hmm.
We must talk about Biden in a minute, but there's just a question from Andrew Brown in the chat. Andrew.
This is a kind of wide-ranging question, but I've been really, really struck by the kind of overlap between various styles of denying reality, if you want to put it that way. Trump pretending that he's won the election. A lot of wacko groups I follow on Facebook, Prophets for Trump, that sort of thing, proclaiming that, it's a done deal. He's won. God has sorted this out. All you have to do is to believe. And it'll all become clear. And this wanders off into QAnon, which is, again, actually quite important, it seems to me. And I just wondered if the panelists had any thoughts on what seems to me a peculiarly American style of believing that if you just want something badly enough, if you name it, if you decree it, if you say God's done it, it will come true. And this seems to me to be the principle on which Trump operates too.
Norman Vincent Peale. That's all you need to know.
Yes, that's a great chunk of it.
He's a victor. Victory can't. This is why in COVID he had to be the victor in COVID. This is, this Jeff Charlotte, who's a really insightful journalist, has said that Trump is a prosperity gospel preacher, and in this, I think he is. He's going to say I don't think he can admit that he's losing, and I think it's he thinks he's on God's. I don't know if he thinks he's on God's side, but this is how he wins. This is his whole career, so I don't think he's. And I think to call them wacko is to underestimate how big they are. Pentecostalism worldwide is growing. Prosperity gospel here is very, and I would probably argue with Tom that I think Paula White has been the most influential preacher in America the last 4 years. Now she might disappear, but she rallied those evangelicals all together. And the fact that she can sit in the same room with Jack Graham and Robert Jeffress, who can't stand Pentecostals and charismatics, and get them all to be her friends, I guess it shows the unifying power of Trump, but also the influence of that group. And they're not small. I think that, I don't know if this is, one thing that's really interesting is just the fervor of devotion to Trump and how many people showed up. Trump has been right in that the polls were there's a huge gap and people didn't want him. And he's, it's been a split razor's edge. He has more influence and more devotion and a pulse on a part of America that some we reporters sometimes miss. And I think he's right to say we got more votes than any other president. Now Biden got more, but he still got more than 70 million. That's not something that's going to go away. And I think the kind of, we can laugh at other people's religious practice, which is, I think, can be dangerous. But I think to say that other groups whose religious practice sounds weird to us don't matter is a mistake. That's a religion reporter of me preaching.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry for that.
To sort of thinking about Joe Biden and how his religion is going to play. Who do you expect to see on his White House Advisory Council, Tom? He's going to have one.
Well, I don't know that I can reel off a list of names. I think that you can be certain that there will be a number of Black Protestants. There are some, very eloquent. We'll have to see what happens with Warnock in Georgia, who is the presiding preacher at Martin Luther King Jr.'s church in Atlanta. He's now running for Senate, but if he doesn't make it, I think he'll be a very influential figure. I'm sure that there will be some prominent Catholic leaders. I think that it's a little bit risky for Catholic leaders to become too deeply involved in politics, because the official position of the Catholic Church is not to endorse candidates or to become too involved politically. But there certainly would be some strong lay Catholic leaders that could be play influential roles. I'm also guessing that he will reach out to sort of the interfaith community. I mean, if you look at Kamala Harris, her father was a Baptist, her mother was a Hindu. She's sort of very familiar with both traditions, and she sort of personifies this kind of interfaith idea or multi-faith idea that is becoming much more important in America's future. And so I wouldn't be surprised if if Joe Biden makes a big effort to sort of give a very much of a multi-faith flavor to any sort of religion advisory group that he puts together.
I see that Bob posted in the chat, the Religion News Service, suggesting who the faith advisors might be. I mean, but Bob, will we see Biden in the Oval Office with a bunch of clerics and other religious people praying over him, or is that a picture?
You might see that. You won't see the same group of people. You won't see him laying hands. You might see Barber in there praying. I think he's much more. But I think you're also going to see him going to mass a lot and praying a lot and carrying his rosary. It's going to be different. It's actually very interesting for religion reporters to cover, because we haven't had a Catholic president in a long time, and someone who's conspicuously Catholic. Like he's every picture. We're gonna have to remember there's a difference between going to church and going to mass, and learn a whole bunch of things. I think he'll be. He won't be. I think the religious leaders may demand more of him rather than just support him. I think William Barber, I think he's probably going to be with his advisors, I would guess. But he has a sermon on Twitter about, you've been chosen to do all these things, and you got to fight for the light and not the darkness, and for justice. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for him to deliver the kind of things that his faith coalition wants, which is, issues of race and economics and poverty and justice and more civility. And how will that all come about? And how does he make that work in this kind of divided time?
Yeah, one quick comment I'd add too, just to kind of, again, a big picture comment that I think we see here. But I think that the multi-faith thing is the key thing we're going to see. It's going to be, I think, a group that's representative of the religious diversity of America. And I remember, I know, Bob, you guys at RNS and probably you at NPR, like when we shifted from the Obama administration to Trump, and we were trying to figure out, like, so, okay, what's the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships Advisory Council going to look like? There was no clear answer to that, because all Trump did was gather this very informal group of people around him and he called it an evangelical advisory group. It wasn't a faith advisory group or even a religious, it was an evangelical group, a very narrow, proportion of the population. So I think that's going to be the biggest thing. And like in the Obama years, for example, Melissa Rogers, who headed up the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, was someone who's an attorney by training, whose specialty is separation of church and state. Like, it's a far cry from what we saw with Obama's thing. So I think the multi-faith nature of it, and I think the official, we'll be able to know, right? I think these people will be posted on a page, their credentials will be there, we'll know who they are, and we'll be able to kind of see, something that I think represents the broader faith of Americans.
What about the White House relations with the Vatican? They were strained under Donald Trump, although there was some agreement, I think, on certain aspects of foreign policy. But the two men didn't like each other very much. I mean, do we expect to see Biden at the Vatican soon, do you think? He quoted Fratelli Tutti, didn't he, in a speech last month? So he's reading him.
I'm sure that Joe Biden would like to have an audience at the Vatican. It won't be anytime soon, given we haven't seen any presidential travel for, throughout this COVID period outside the United States, but everything has been very limited. So it won't be happening anytime soon, but I'm sure that Joe Biden would be thrilled to be associated with Pope Francis.
Yeah. There's a great story of an early visit Biden early in his Senate career had with JP II. that went on apparently forever, and they couldn't stop the two from talking. So I'm sure he'd be thrilled. But yeah, I think Tom's right. The COVID right now means you can't really go anywhere. And Italy's got all kinds of problems. So Italy's not thrilled to have Americans traveling there, no matter if you're the president or whoever you are.
There's a lot of division, isn't there, and a lot of criticism among conservative Catholics of the Pope at the moment. I'm just wondering whether the fact that there's a Catholic president in post will have any, whether he'll become the sort of focus of those sorts of divisions, or whether he might actually be a sort of unifying character in that regard.
There is a very well-organized and well-financed right wing of the Catholic Church in this country that came out very strongly for the Trump campaign, a group called CatholicVote.org that spent millions of dollars on behalf of Donald Trump. In the past, they've been around for a few years, but their importance really zoomed up this year. And there's also a group called the Federalist Society that's been very active in promoting certain judges. They're also pretty much associated with the right wing of the Catholic Church. So we've seen the Catholic Church and the Catholics in the United States being deeply polarized, just like the rest of the electorate has been polarized. So I'm not sure that Joe Biden is going to be very effective at unifying American Catholics for that reason.
What difference will it make that he's a Catholic?
I certainly don't think we're seeing anything like the internal debates we were having around John F. Kennedy's election as president, for example. I mean, there was all kinds of anti-Catholic sentiment and suspicions about him having a hotline to the Pope and all this kind of stuff. And this was mostly coming from the white Protestant world, at the time, these kind of suspicions. But I think one of the things that the kind of Christian right political movement has done is scrambled those Protestant Catholic divisions. Right, so that we basically see, for example, the selection of Amy Coney Barrett as a Supreme Court justice was seen as nothing but a victory by white evangelical Protestants. Now, that's a pretty remarkable thing when you think about the history of Catholic-Protestant relations in this country. But I think it's the way that they've been kind of scrambled, and I think Tom's right on this, that the kind of conservative right, among Catholics, is now more in political alignment with white evangelical Protestants, and kind of as a force, while we're seeing the kind of Latino Catholics kind of more politically aligned with like kind of the more liberal end of the Protestant world. So this kind of, again, it's kind of partisanship is just run through in the way that these alignments have really taken down what were kind of huge religious barriers in the past, but they've served as kind of a solvent. The political alliances have kind of served as a solvent to kind of lower those boundaries today.
Still on this, what is what's the kind of breakdown of forces? I was reading Where Peter Is, the sort of roughly centrist Catholic blog, at any rate, anti-vegano. And the editor there was saying that he reckons about 80% of the sort of hard John Paul II traditionalist types were now overlapping into QAnon and believing the same sort of things. And it seems to me that these are very similar styles of conspiratorial thought. But how large a segment is that of the Catholic Church on the ground?
I don't think we know, because it's hard I would think it's hard to poll QAnon folks. I think it'd be hard to, I do think like the QAnon is, and what we're seeing in social media is part of this bigger issue, and part of one of the things where Trump succeeded in just scrambling what people think is true. I mean, Trump, his fake news social media campaigns and the kind of, I don't know if you call it democratizing, but the death of experts has mean anyone can be an expert now. Anyone can be an expert. Anyone can be. We put these tools in folks' hands, which are great because you can reach a lot of people, but anyone can reach a lot of people. So you can get a video on YouTube, and then someone shows up with a gun at a pizza place thinking there's, kids held underneath in the basement. So I think that's going to be an ongoing problem for every religious group, because if you're a journalist who says, no, here are facts, if your faith leader says this is the way it is, no one has to listen to you. Everyone else is making it's do-yourself religion, do-yourself politics. So QAnon is just a symptom of that, I think. But it is powerful, and it is, it's appealing to a certain group of folks, I guess.
Yeah. One quick thing just on how much trouble I think we're in terms of trusted knowledge. I think that's right. As we asked in our in PRI's pre-election survey, we asked about who do Americans trust a lot to give them accurate information about the coronavirus pandemic. And now it's true that only 14% of the country said they trusted Donald Trump, but only a little bit less than 3 in 10 said they trusted Joe Biden. And there was no source in the survey among 8 different sources we gave. The highest one was 51%, barely a majority, and that was Dr. Anthony Fauci. Right behind him were university research centers, and that was only 50%. So that means that there's no source out there, right? Because I think everything's been cast into doubt, where a solid majority, anything looking like 70% or 3/4 of the country says, yes, we trust this a lot. It's down. Really, all the sources that were down. So I think there's a lot of confusion, a lot of just so much disinformation out there, and confusion that I think that does leave fertile ground, for things like QAnon to really run amok.
Social psychologists, the appeal of conspiracy theories, and what their conclusion is that they appeal to people who are anxious, who are confused, as Robbie said, who feel alienated, and that leaves them sort of desperate for clear answers because they don't feel like they're getting a lot of clear answers. And in sort of to that kind of mentality, conspiratorial theories, because they present this kind of unified and very clear black and white explanation of why things are the way they are going to appeal to people who have that sort of feelings of uncertainty and confusion as they try to make sense of the world around them.
That's where Biden's got his work cut out for him, hasn't he? In trying to sort of deal with that sort of anxiety and lack of trust and confusion and so on. Just a final question perhaps about, with the Supreme Court as it is now, what are the issues where religious groups are going to make the most noise, do you think, in the Biden presidency? Where are we going to hear them most loudly? On what issues?
I think the big issue is, one of the big issues is going to be around LGBTQ rights. There have been sort of dueling executive orders in the last 2 administrations, with President Obama very early issuing an executive order that called on, said that federal contractors have to abide by non-discrimination provision, can't discriminate against LGBTQ people. And then the Trump administration reversed that executive order. I think that this kind of dueling around religious freedom concerns as voiced by conservatives versus anti-discrimination concerns voiced by progressives, I think the tension between those 2 concerns is not going to go away, and if anything, is likely to continue to sort of broil in the coming months.
I just wonder how Biden might define religious liberty rather differently from Donald Trump, for whom it was, I'm free to oppress who I want, basically. How might he reframe the debate around religious liberty, do you think?
Well, I think that he will endorse religious freedom, the way that, in the sense of, there's 2 clauses in the First Amendment that have to do with religious freedom. One is the freedom to exercise your religion, and the other is the freedom not to have the state establish a religion. And that the tension around the definition of religious freedom always is sort of the tension between those 2 clauses. And I'm guessing that Joe Biden is going to be more likely to emphasize the non-establishment part of that provision as opposed to the free exercise part, which is what President Trump really emphasized.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think maybe this is just an observation. I think he might wonder if he will learn some from the Obama administration, which I think was tone deaf on some religious issues, I think, and might learn from that. He is seems to be a little more he's tied into the Catholic Church, which is a bigger part of the religious landscape than Obama was. I think the Obama administration, when it did the contraceptive mandate right after Obamacare passed, which with a lot of help from Catholic hospitals, seems to have been a strategic mistake that energized a lot of these folks. I think there are folks It's sort of religious colleges, for example, that require their students to hold and faculty to hold certain beliefs and practices will. I don't know how he'll deal with that, but I think the Supreme Court's going to have to deal with that. I think they see something like the Equality Act as an existential threat. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. So though I think there was a lot of concern that the Affordable Care Act would be thrown out with the new Supreme Court justices, and so far it doesn't seem to be leaning that way. It'd be interesting to see if Biden can be the kind of uniter he wants to be. If he can get the kind of the differentiated and warring factions of American society and warring religious groups to work together on anything, to say, well, here are things we agree on, we can get them done. Can we do something on race? Can we make things better? I think his part of his appeal was his calm, and which I think comes from his deep faith and having been through difficult times and his belief in America. And he'll say, I think he has some appeal on that, whether he can avoid the partisan. I think one telling thing is, I was speaking with an African-American evangelical woman this week. She posted, "We're going to pray for President Biden." And, all of a sudden came under attack for saying, "We're going to pray for the president." And Jeffress even came under attack for seeming to say. So we're so divided, can even the normal things that religion does, work for bettering society, praying for the president, trying to unify people, will that succeed? And maybe Biden can do that because he's so different in style, quiet, enthusiastic about America, not going to get involved in every single Twitter controversy. Maybe he has some hope for doing that. But I think that's the big thing. I think we'll be watching Biden to say, like, oh, what can he do? And can he wrangle the American religious landscape into getting along or not?
One of the things that PRI has really contributed is to underscore the changing American attitudes towards LGBTQ issues and same-sex marriage. To make a big stand on that is kind of going against the grain of where America is going, right, Robbie?
No, thank you. I was actually going there, so thank you for teeing that up. I do think that's one real difference between, say, how LGBT issues were playing during the Obama administration and how they play now. It's worth remembering that Obama himself did not support same-sex marriage when he was first running for office, right? And the American public, there was not a majority support for same-sex marriage when he was first running for office in 2018. It's during his tenure as president that the country moves into majority support, that he moves, the Democratic Party adopts this as an official position. And it's worth saying our most recent survey had no less than 70% of Americans today supporting same-sex marriage. That is every religious group in the country, with the lone exception of white evangelical Protestants. But African-American Protestants, white Catholics, Latino Catholics, every other major religious group supporting same-sex marriage. And the same is largely true. 2/3 supporting allowing transgender people to serve in the military. We have 2/3 opposing allowing small businesses to discriminate against gay and lesbian people on the basis of their religious beliefs. So many of these religious liberty issues, the ball is in a very different place than it was in the last Democratic administration. And one danger I think we could have is we could have a court that puts down a marker that's in a very, very different place than the country is. And it looks like maybe the country was 20 years ago. But I think that issue really has moved to being a near consensus issue. I mean, it really, there's very few issues that you have 70% support on anything. So I think we're getting there. We even have a majority of seniors in the country supporting same-sex marriage today. So that's really notable. So I think on that issue, the issues on abortion, the divides there about where they haven't moved that much. We got about 6 in 10 Americans supporting its legality. That's really consistent for decades. But on this issue of LGBT issues, I think we're moving to a consensus issue. But I think the things that have to be front and center on his plate are the racial divides in the country. That is the thing that is really, we're at a moment of real reckoning on this. I think that's where he's really got his work cut out for him.
Thank you. We are up on the hour, exactly. And so we must call it a day there. Thank you so much to the three of you, Tom, Robbie and Bob, for joining us. Do have a good rest of day. And thank you everyone else for being here, and have a good evening.